We're live.
We're live. Good
Hello,
afternoon, everyone, and welcome to continuing the conversations from the last roundtable that we have. And thank you so much for your continued support with our events. We're really humbled by the support you have continuously given us as a community. And you guys know how we start our events. So please use the chat and tell us where you are and what the weather is like. We always start it in very British fashion. I'm in Aberdeen and beautiful weather in Scotland at the moment.
Someone's asked, is there a conference call number for this to dial in? But I'm not sure.
There's none actually.
Oh.
I don't think there's a conference call number.
Yeah. Sorry, David. Hope you're well.
Ooh, Surrey is glorious. Wigan is glorious.
Geneva.
Sunny South Wales. Surrey. Ellie, it's gorgeous. Where's Ellie, Sue? I'm trying to. Derbyshire is just right. Reading is very sunny. Oh, envy. North Wales is lovely. Sunny in Geneva too. Goodness, I need to go back to Geneva one of these days. Sunny in Marlow. Okay, so let's start today because we've got a lot of things to talk about. And let me just do a quick share. And just a second. So Ren can properly welcome us.
Sunny everywhere by the sounds of it today.
It's sunny everywhere, yes.
Cutting the ribbon on summer. Hello, everyone, and welcome to wherever you are in the world. And this is a continuation of the very recent event we had, which everyone was really interested in, regarding maximizing the use of Microsoft Teams, but also looking at the underlying governance issues, because it's such a great tool for collaboration. But of course, there are questions about what content goes where and how to create and capture the records that are within Teams, etc. So really just for me, for just a few seconds, to welcome all our speakers, again, from all over the world. And Maria is going to give me the next slide in just a second, which will give us today's running order. Fortunately, you only have me for about another 30 seconds or so. And there we go. So that's me just saying hi to everyone. Welcome on behalf of the Information and Records Management Society. This is a session run by one of our groups, the Information Management Technology Group. And as members will know, we have a vibrant community that puts on a lot of events, either on what I might call a corporate basis through our annual conference and the Microsoft events we have, or through the various regional and sector-specific groups that we have. So we're going to open with Brendan Lee. Oh, and we've gone back from Microsoft. So welcome, Brendan. Thank you ever so much for joining us. And we'll just get the slide back in a second. I should have memorized this running order, but of course I didn't. So welcome to all our other guests, to Dave, to Nate,
I'm so sorry.
to Rob, to Stuart, etc. So that's enough from me, and I'm going to hand over to Maria.
Okay, thank you, Ren. So we've got a full registration right now. But before we start, and before I hand you over to Brandon, let me just stop the sharing and get Brandon. Brandon, you ready? Let me just share your slides.
Just checking you can still hear me, right?
Yes, we could.
Awesome.
So let me just choose the slide now. Just give me a second because I've got. Okay, here we go. And there we go. Brandon, over to you. Brandon is with the Microsoft Information Governance Product Group, and thank you so much for joining us, Brandon. So here we go.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, my name is Brendan Lee, and I am a senior product manager at Microsoft for the Microsoft Information Governance product suite on the Customer Acceleration or CAT team. So my team works with large customers around the world to help them deploy Microsoft Information Governance solutions. And as such, we work very closely with the information governance engineering teams to help align our products and features with the needs of our customers. With that said, today I'm going to give a very short review of the capabilities available for governing content with Microsoft Teams. All right, next slide. So today we offer the ability to apply container level retention policies to many different components of Microsoft Teams. Now, our retention policies are considered container level as they apply to entire locations, such as all messages within a Teams channel or all of a specific user's one-on-one messages, rather than individual items. These policies generally offer the ability to retain so that nothing can be deleted in a way in which it's no longer discoverable, retain and then delete so that following a retention period, the items can be automatically cleaned up so that your organization isn't over retaining data, or the ability to simply delete after a period of time with no retention, meaning that users can choose to delete sooner, but automatic deletion will occur at a time frame that meets your organization's regulatory or policy requirements. Now, as I mentioned, these container policies can apply to one-on-one chat messages and messages within channels, but we've also recently added support for messages within private or shared, or otherwise known as Team Connect channels. Next slide. But we don't just allow you to govern messages. In fact, you can further govern files stored within Microsoft Teams with container level retention policies, or even at the individual item level with retention labels. Now, retention labels allow users to individually apply governance policies to each file based on your regulatory requirements. But to help ease the burden of end users, you can also choose to auto-apply retention labels based on sensitive information, keywords, and even machine learning via trainable classifiers. We recently released 9 new built-in trainable classifiers, including legal agreements, finance documents, healthcare, plus we have more in development and on the way. With these retention labels, you have more flexible options, such as when the retention period will start, whether the item should be immutable, and what other actions should occur after retention. Next slide. Now, one very common feedback we heard from customers was, while the options to govern the various forms of data was great, the way those policies were deployed was too rigid, especially for larger multinational or complex organizations that may have very different requirements for different entities within their organization. So with that feedback, we created our latest large feature to hit general availability, adaptive policy scopes. With adaptive policy scopes, organizations now have more flexibility in how policies are targeted, such as using properties or attributes to determine policy inclusion or exclusion. This feature also removes some commonly frustrating limits that affect the legacy policy behavior, which we now call static scopes. We've seen a huge explosion of customers interested in deploying Microsoft Teams governance with adaptive policy scopes, as they can now, for example, choose to apply policies based on the country the users may reside in or the departments they work for. Next slide.
Sorry, Maria, could you hit it into presenter mode, do you think, to enlarge the screen view, please?
All right. Now, you may have noticed that I mentioned you can use labeling with files that are stored in SharePoint or OneDrive, but not with messages or chats in Microsoft Teams. Now, we hear this request a lot, and they're now collecting feedback from our customers as to how they want to use or how they would use retention labeling within Microsoft Teams. Now, this feature interests you or would be useful for your organizations. Please do consider filling out the survey that's available at aka.ms/Teams retention survey. All right, so that is my quick overview of information governance within Microsoft Teams. I have my colleague Kira within the chat as well. She's one of the PMs on the information governance engineering team. So we'll both be able to answer any questions that you may have within the chats that come up from this.
Thank you so much, Brandon, and really appreciate that. So one of the things that we work with the community is we give a lot of feedback through the chat channels that we have, through the polls, through the questions, and through our CAB working group as well. So I think the next step from this one is the feedback that we get from this event. And all our other future events we'll make sure that we keep you posted, and so that it could actively be included, because we're proud of the community that we have. The community that we have are actually the users, the ones who use and the ones who manage the actual functionality of records management and information governance on the platform. So thank you. So let me just do a quick overview of, I have so many screens that I am managing right now. Please bear with me for a while. As I move from the Microsoft one, going back to our slides. Bear with me. And there are some questions. Ren or some of the guys, would you like to answer some while I organize our overview?
Oh, just going to the questions tab. Can Microsoft, so yes, from Pete, can Microsoft change the current process whereby a new SPO, SharePoint Online site, is set up behind each private channel and instead create a permission document library for each private channel created within the existing SharePoint Online site, which is already attached to the team? So I guess that's to try and control the sheer creation of the number of sites and document libraries.
It's the separation. It's very familiar and very common. Brandon, is this something that you'd like to answer, please?
So can we kind of dive into that a little deeper? What is actually being asked for?
I think this is something to do with the private channels. Mm-hmm. With the creation of the private channel, a new SharePoint site is created, which is detached from where you've created it. It's kind of, as you know, this is an ongoing question for a while now, and mm-hmm. I'll lead it up to you first before I move to the poll results.
Sure. Yeah, and that is a team's behavior that I'm aware of. Now, I don't know that there's anything that's on the roadmap to change that behavior, but I would suggest putting in what's called a DCR, or design change request, so that the Teams product group knows that's something that's highly requested and wanted by customers. So any customer that has the ability to create a support case can request to put in a design change request.
Brilliant. And there's another question. Thanks, Brendan. There's another question from Sean, which is there a policy or label, etc., that will let you retain or delete an entire team, i.e. both the group and the container as well, and not just aspects of the content? So is there a policy label approach to retain or delete an entire team, both group and container?
So not currently. So the container-based policies apply to the actual container, but they delete the items within the container, but not the container itself. Now, those containers can be deleted by you, and that data would be retained as essentially kind of an inactive state, so until that retention period is over. But the policy itself wouldn't delete the actual team. I think within Teams, you can actually configure like an expiration for those teams, though. But we definitely could take that as feedback, as something that would be interesting.
There's just one last one for now from Patricia. I'm not sure that we don't need just a little bit more context here. The actual question is, can the retention labels cope with event-based retention, e.g. 7 years after the tenancy ends?
Yes. So for currently, retention labels apply to the files that are stored within Teams, SharePoint, or OneDrive sites, and those labels can be based on an event if you choose to use event-based labeling. Yes.
Brilliant. Thank you, and thanks to Patricia and to Pete and to Sean for all those questions so far.
Yes, and we could of course, Brandon, if you want, you could directly answer them as well. Let me just quickly share some overview of what has happened previously with our polls. Now, when we had a previous roundtable, and I'm just going to name out the first 5. The first poll that we had was, what were the top 3 concerns for the governance of content in Teams? And the audiences, most of you probably have been there. The first one that they're really concerned about is for the Teams site to be secure, compliant, and for privacy to be protected. The next one is information silos. I think that's the reason for the private channels. The next one is content without context. And the next one is losing Teams content. And the last one is duplicated content around Teams because of where they reside. Maybe the concern is some are in SharePoint, some are in OneDrive. Now, poll 2 was, where are you on your Teams journey? Majority of the audience only use Teams for communication and chat. Some are already going into trying to govern Teams content. That is the first 2 polls that we had. So we are assuming it's the same concern that we have from our audience right now. The next one is, where would you like to be this calendar year? And the answers are pretty much the same way. They want to maximize the use of Teams, and they want to be able to govern the Teams content, the content that they have in the Teams that they have, and rightly so. That's really almost of equal weight. In terms of what is your policy on records in Teams, this is something that we have found quite common, and majority of the answer is we do not have one. Even in huge organizations, this is something that we commonly find. And with that, as I mentioned, please continue to ask your questions and do some chats. There are people who might be able to respond to that. But right now, what we would like to do is hand you over to Stephen Lemon of the Northern Ireland Civil Service Group for his presentation. And I was quite lucky to have worked with Stephen for a while, about a year or so ago. And this is all about the experience they have at NICS with implementing Teams. Over to you, Stephen.
Okay, thank you, Maria. I don't actually have a presentation as such, but I do have a few notes to read from, and hopefully you'll find this quite useful. Forgive me if I keep looking to my left because my camera's in front of me, but my other screen has my notes better. So yeah, very quickly, I just want to give you a summary of how we in Northern Ireland actually are organised as a government. I'm sure most people on the call aren't familiar with Northern Ireland in general, never mind how we do government here. So we actually have 9 government departments as it stands, and each department is a data controller or public authority in their own right. So they deal with their own FOI, EAR requests and data protection requests, and they also implement their own retention and disposal schedules, all the normal government stuff. But my role is basically to work with each of those 9 departments to try where possible to set agreed NICS standards for all of those things. And the other, add a further layer of bureaucracy, we actually have an internal shared service for IT. So all our IT services are provided by an internal shared service, as well as the Northern Ireland departments. They also provide services to other public bodies. And this includes both hardware, so our laptops and screens and servers, but also all the software that we use as well. Currently, we use Microsoft Outlook for email, but we also have 365. We also use WebEx for most of our meetings, and we have Cisco Jabber for instant chat, as well as the bits and pieces in 365. We also have an EDRM solution, content manager, previously known as Trim, and we've been using that since 2005. Sorry, one of the children's right beside me annoying me. And we've had little or no SharePoint presence ever in the Northern Ireland Civil Service, and we do still have some shared drives that people use, but we keep those to as much of a minimum as possible, and they're only created in exceptional circumstances. We also have mailbox limits on our inboxes, so mailboxes can't grow like to extraordinary sizes. I think the smallest one is 1 gig. I think that, I'm not quite sure. I think it's 1 gig. But I suppose the important rule that we have is we have a 3-month rule on emails. So after 3 months, the person has to make a decision either to move it to Content Manager or it'll automatically delete. And if it automatically deletes, there's no opportunity to return that. And it's a manual transfer from Outlook into Content Manager. So that's like a very quick summary of like our government setup, but also our sort of IT setup as well. So moving on to
I think we've lost Stephen for. I think we've lost.
Yes, he's frozen here as well. So.
Yes. So he was going to move on to Teams. Let's give him a few moments.
While we're doing so, actually, what I forgot to say earlier, of course, is a belated happy 5th birthday to Microsoft Teams, which I think on the 14th of March turned 5 years of age from general availability and release. So there we go. A little happy birthday wish to it.
Yeah. Well, while we're doing that, I'm like thinking, should we move on to maybe, or do we have some burning questions in the audience while we're waiting for Stephen? Okay, let me look at the chat.
I think we're pretty much up to date, and thank you to
Vivek. Vivek seems to be.
Brendan and everyone.
Yep, everybody seems to be having some form of technical issue at the moment. So what we'll do is, why don't we quickly move over to.
I mean, there's an interesting thing there that we have just discussed. Well, we're actively discussing in the cab, which is about grabbing a Teams chat as a record. A question from Helen. A question she keeps getting asked internally is how to capture conversations where decisions are made or approvals are given in the chat. And I know we've had a conversation around, it's not necessarily even capturing the whole chat thread, it's the important bit. Or are there other options within Teams to direct people to when an approval is explicitly needed? So this is
very up to the as of the moment, there is none. And in terms of automated, this is something that is being discussed at the CAB working group. The option or the design option that is currently being looked at is to implement a functionality that is very similar to e-discovery. So the interface of e-discovery, where you just put in the time, start and stop where you'd want to capture that chat. As of the moment, that is the design that I think Microsoft is thinking of putting in place. That's why we are really asking the community if you have some ideas as to how it can be captured, other than the manual capture that you might want to be using right now. That is the design that we are going for at the moment for an e-discovery type interface to capture those chats in Teams. Rob, would you like to answer?
Yes, certainly.
Yeah.
So, from my perspective, I think it'd be really useful to have the ability to flag certain parts of a conversation as being more important, or potentially even going as far as to apply a retention label to certain parts of a conversation. The challenge is, how do you identify what is a conversation as opposed to a complete chat? At the moment, retention is applied on that complete container. And obviously the next level down is almost each individual time that you hit enter. So it's finding that grouping in between that uniquely identifies a conversation that potentially people could flag up as saying, well, actually, there was a decision made there. It's not ideal because you'll still be relying on end users noticing that they've just done something important and flagging it as such. So it's not always going to work in every circumstance, but until machine learning comes along and solves the problem for us, I can't see a better solution myself.
Okay. Brandon, would you like to add something just in case that you've got some new things going on at Microsoft that you'd like to tell us about? That's not under NDA.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I was responding to the chat, so I didn't actually hear the question.
It has something to do with being able to capture record of.
So if you've got a Teams chat going on and there's an approval in it or something similar, I believe somewhere in Teams there is a seek approval function that's separate to the chat, but
yes,
which I don't know much about. But also within a chat, there's this sort of ongoing consideration about how do you capture that bit of the chat or the entire chat where the approval's given as a record, and what current thinking and best practice is around that.
Got it. Okay. Yeah. So right now, you know, there's not really anything that would be specific to, you know, the chat because it has an approval within it. It would have to be related to it would have to be included within like a container policy, like a retention policy. However, like I said, you know, we are collecting feedback for labeling potential within Teams. So that'd be really good feedback to include in that survey. You know, it's something that would be found useful for your organization.
And Brendan, just as an aside to, or adding to that, is there a capability, a separate sort of button you can press in Teams? I'm sure I've seen it, where you can seek approval for something as a specific function within Teams.
I think there is an approval add-in. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's an add-in based upon what level of license you have or whatever, I guess.
Yeah. Now, keep in mind too that, you know, as far as retention goes, we keep the messages. So as long as the add-in is included within the messages themselves, then it would be retained under a retention policy. But if it's something outside of the message, such as like a separate window, then it wouldn't necessarily be retained.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Oh, I see Stephen right now. So Stephen, would you like to start again with your, not really start again, but continue with your discussion on how NICS has implemented Teams?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, sorry, I didn't even realize that I'd disappeared. Apologies. So I don't really know where I got to, but I'll start where I think I got to. So, yeah, so whenever we decided to bring Teams in, we had some workshops with Maria and our colleagues in HP, and then we also had a 3-day workshop with Microsoft, and we went through all the nitty-gritty of all the settings and how we wanted it to work specifically for ourselves in the NICS. And at the end of that, we got an extremely detailed report telling us exactly what buttons to press and what bits to turn on and what parts to turn off. So really, it was implemented then by our IT colleagues, and from that we then were able to produce some guidance document, and some messaging has been developed as well for staff. Currently at the minute, all NICS staff, so it's about 24,000 people, have an E3 license, and we also have around about 50 E5 licenses in place as well. And really our internal process, we have an internal process for creating a team. It's not automated, it's actually a service request. And that has to be signed off by, for people in the UK government, they might understand the information asset owner role or a grade 7 role. So it has to be signed off by one of them. And 2 team owners have to be named as well. And we've agreed that we've actually set 2 standard templates. So we have our standard one is where we keep retention for any documents, chats, etc. to just basically 3 months. But we've also established a project template. And in that we are setting the retention for 1 year, but we are encouraging people to save as they go and not to leave everything for a year. And and they actually have a project template set up, you have to provide proof of a PID or a project plan, and an SRO has to be named before that'll be authorized by our information managers. So in general, basically what we try to do in the Northern Ireland Civil Service is have all our retention and disposal, or sorry, all our disposal set at 3 months, regardless of the platform that it's on. So that really encourages our users to actually transfer any information that they need to keep into our EDRM. And then when it's in our EDRM, it then falls within with our retention disposal schedules. And then we just do that as normal. So whether that's 3 years delete or 15 years keep and transfer to our public record office or whatever it is, something like that. So yeah, that's me finished quickly going through my notes. I don't know how much of that actually I didn't really realize it. Sorry, it disappeared. So I don't know if you heard all of that or what, but happy to take any comments or any queries or questions throughout the rest of the event, or if you want to chase up with me later, yeah, you're more than welcome to. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Stephen. So as you've heard from Stephen, they really started with governance at the start before implementing anything. That was proof of concept first. That's the reason why, you know, the issues that they're having right now is not as escalated as when during COVID, it was quickly deployed. Now, moving on. So if you have any questions for Stephen, please put it on the questions tab or the chat, and he might be. I'm sure Stephen could check the questions there. He's so used to answering your questions most of the time when he attends our events. Now, moving on quickly, let me introduce to you. As you know, I have now joined Capgemini, and I'm bringing to you two experts that we have within this conversations to discuss the use cases that they have dealt with in terms of Teams and 365 in general. So let me introduce Nathan Hambridge and Dave Kerrigan. And Dave and Nathan, I'm giving the floor to you guys.
Hi, everyone. Hopefully you'll be able to see my screen in a second. This is just a quick introduction to myself and Dave. So my name's Nathan Hambridge. So I'm a senior manager within Capgemini. By trade, I'm a enterprise architect. So I sit between the business and IT. And we'll go over some of the work that we're doing in a minute. So Dave, you'd like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, Dave Kerrigan, work in the content services team in Capgemini UK. I've been working with Microsoft, SharePoint, Office 365, and before that OpenText for many, many years.
Cool. So what we've got is just a couple of slides that just highlight some of the work that we've done over the last couple of years, and it's been highlighted by Dave just then. We've both been in the Microsoft space for quite some time, hence, as you can see, grey hair, right? So one of the jobs that I've done in the last 3 to 5 years was actually a consolidation of Microsoft tenants. So initially, it was 5 down to 1, and then it basically turned out to 72 down to 12. And what was highlighted, by Stephen just a little bit ago, was actually get it right first is a really important bit, because when you then have to try and unpick this all to migrate or clean up, it becomes a problem. So some of the work that we did with this was working out the tools and the platforms and the limitations within Teams, SharePoint, OneDrive, and working out how we can consolidate across tenants, but then also looking at what the user experience will be. So yes, you can move only certain things. So, certain tools can move a certain amount of chat. What is that? How would SharePoint sites go across, and then working out what are the best tools for the job are. And what we ended up having to do is basically just go to the market and look at all of the tools that were present. And we ended up with a choice of 3. And the reason being is because, you know, the user experience for X required this, and then moving forward. So it very, very complex. But the idea of actually moving from one tenant to another actually gave us the ability to clean up as we moved along. So naming conventions were sort of, you know, out the window when they initially rolled out Teams, because it was all about, you know, we need to be able to collaborate. It was not, you know, we're going to, you know, roll this out gently. We're going to do the whole user experience. We're going to control the naming convention. We're going to explain how it all works first. It was a knee-jerk reaction, which is, right, let's roll it out and then let it go. And you'll have heard the, you know, Teams bloat, where you end up with, you know, you've got 3,000 users, but you've got 30 to 60,000 team sites. So we had quite a bit of that as well. And then another project that we were working on, which is, and this was COVID related, this was a proposition that we needed to put in place for a global bank, where they needed you know, teams to be able to communicate, because everyone's now working from home. They needed to go to the cloud rather than what they were doing. So initially it was 90,000 users that we were rolling out, but there was a process of migrating their mail across at the same time. So we need to explain to them from a governance and compliance point of view, if you are in a hybrid environment and you're not using ghost mailboxes, then retention of Teams chat is not to the mailbox. Then you would need to look at something externally. I think we were looking at Envision and some other products that would be able to do sort of a man in the middle sort of capture. But whilst we were also doing that, you'll see under the SharePoint, we were looking at how do we create a tiered security model in Office 365, which is pretty flat. So how do we work out using AD to control company-wide sites for information? Then how do you make, you know, team sites or department sites? And then how do you secure specific sites like HR that need additional ones? So there was quite a lot of work that we did in and around that on controlling everything that we do. And I'll hand over to Dave to explain this one.
Thanks, Nathan. So it's just one more example. I'm not too sure how typical this one is. I think it's probably, it's got some common themes that perhaps some of you have experienced for yourself. So I've seen goes perhaps against slightly how Stephen's been doing things, but this is another large UK public sector organisation rolling out Office 365. I think that started maybe over 2 years ago, including Teams. And the initial focus really was just on getting the licenses out there and getting the software onto people's devices. So fairly soon, you've got tens of thousands of users having access to it with no restriction on creating new teams, new sites, and also an urgent need to get off some legacy platforms, including SharePoint farms and file servers. So tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands more files needing to come into the new platform, most of that not being structured very well, if at all, or organized before it's moved over. So don't really have too much time to go into a lot of detail on what has been done, but I just wanted to kind of pull out a few highlights here on what we've done to try and meet some of those challenges for this organization, relevant to what we're talking about today, mostly around teams and the kind of governance side of it. So the first one was that they fairly soon realized they needed to introduce a process to control site and team provisioning. So they kept it still self-service, really easy for the users. They can still just request a site or a team when they need it, but behind the scenes it is controlled, it is governed, and if there's approvals needed, that's in place, and that helps to reduce the site sprawl you might get. The next thing they did, and this was part of a plan where they got E5 licenses and wanted to exploit it, was to introduce Microsoft Information Protection. So now all files, all emails are all labeled using sensitivity labels. And then the retention of records is something that there's a real demand for it and a need for it, really. and a pilot's been completed, that was really so far focused on evaluating technically what's available. And if you haven't looked at it before, it's changed quite a lot and really for the better over what was available a few years ago, if you're familiar with older versions of SharePoint or Exchange. And then the organization looking at their requirements, then looking at how it can be adopted by the users and looking at how we can plan next to implement that. So like a lot of organizations, technically rollout happened quite easily, I'd say, but then there's a real need to catch up with the governance and put in place those controls that are really going to be really important going forwards. So that's about as much as I'm going to cover on that one for now.
Excellent. Cool. Is there any questions on that? I know we skipped through it, pretty quickly, but as everyone knows, this is a topic that we could probably talk for hours on, and we were only given 5 to 8 minutes. Thanks, Mary.
Thank you. Just an overview of the issues that we have, but a lot of our audiences, they would be asking some questions on the questions tab or the chat tab. So guys, if you have any questions for both Dave and Nathan, please pop it in the questions tab or the chat so they could respond to you as well. So thank you, Dave and Nathan. Thanks so much.
Thanks.
Those are very good examples where issues are intermixed with the entire 365 implementation, and sometimes the rapid deployment of teams because of the COVID situation in the working remotely. Now, let us welcome Vivek Bhatt of Infotection to provide us a bit of his always brilliant insight on this one. Vivek, handing over the platform to you.
Thank you, Maria. Can you hear me? Can I just do a quick check?
Yes, we can hear you, Vivek.
Okay, hopefully I can also share my screen. So great. I hope my screen is visible as well.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is.
Okay, so I have 5 minutes, so I'll also keep it brief. I have a couple of slides to run through. I think I wanted to bring, alongside all of these discussions about records and retention capabilities, one of the interesting discussions I've been having with, several organizations is related to, adoption of Microsoft Teams has gone on very, very quickly. How should different parts of Microsoft 365 come together? What should be the overall strategy when organizations have OneDrive, SharePoint, Teams? Outlook is still sort of quite heavily used within organizations. How should they get the message out? What's the best way to engage with employees within the organization and kind of build a two-way communication? Whereas quite often we've kind of relied on sort of one-way communication with Outlook and other technologies. So I'm just going to run through a couple of slides here and just kind of take your feedback as well on it, what people think of it. So overall, I mean, employee engagement is changing. We all know that. We are all working from home, remotely, etc. And the question is, Teams is being used and being widely floated around as one of the key enablers for collaboration and communication. So how can we actually best use it? And where does actually Teams fit in with the overall spectrum of everything else that comes along with your Microsoft 365? The problem statement is that the old or the current method is very much around if you have an idea or a question or information to share, whether it is a program or it is collaboration within the team, there's a heavy reliance on emailing to each other. Sometimes tend to be a one-way communication, or the nature of the conversation is that multiple emails being spread across multiple mailboxes. And the change is shifting towards sort of more idea generation, multiple channels, multiple ways of opening a dialogue with people and using that effectively for collaboration. Now, while that is great, we're finding that a number of areas it's getting confusing. Should I use Yammer for posting what type of communication, or should I use Teams for announcements within my team? Or should we be posting something on the intranet? Overall, some of the key areas that we're looking at feedback, of course, from this forum as well, so these are kind of the common problems we see across, how do we disseminate information? How do we reach people? Not just from a leadership point of view, but also when collaborating with our colleagues. What metrics is available to us so that we can measure the effectiveness of how we are communicating and how we are collaborating with people, and how do we really drive that two-way dialogue, which is quite often is missing in the collaboration and communication approach. When we work with documents with our colleagues, it's very well there, but when sending communications about certain initiatives, it still tends to be a one-way communication. And how do we kind of bring that shift from communication based on people receiving it versus people receiving the communication to becoming influencers, within the organization or within their team. Overall, we've kind of tried to map all Microsoft 365 capabilities and see if we can arrive at a common method by which we would recommend how communication and collaboration should happen, and how can we use Teams as the opportunity to potentially be not maybe a single platform, but certainly something that can pull together information, signals, communications from all different parts of Microsoft 365, or as much as possible to provide people kind of as much single place as they can. So we kind of map this out from an individual basis to an organization. And on the y-axis, you see the type of collaboration or communication being from ad hoc to urgent. And what we're finding is that most organizations tend to kind of land into OneDrive corner when it comes to individual and ad hoc collaboration, which tends to be the most prevailing way of how people like to collaborate and communicate with each other. SharePoint becomes kind of a very broad entity, if you see in the middle, ranging from a group-based collaboration to an organization-based collaboration. Now, especially SharePoint is part of Teams. As you all know that, they are all kind of starting to all surface from the Teams interface as well. So for example, we are seeing Yammer, organizations which are using Yammer or Microsoft Stream are increasingly trying to use it as an application or a component of Teams where information is posted in Yammer and is available through the Teams interface using the communities application. Similarly, OneDrive for Business, we're seeing that people are more likely to kind of access files or share files in OneDrive for Business through Teams chats or in channels versus going to their OneDrive for Business folders and actually sending that as an email to somebody else. So overall, the plotting kind of suggests that there is a developing thinking in how Teams can evolve as that single interface where you have maybe SharePoint intranet communications. If your intranet is on SharePoint, Microsoft Teams brings that into Teams interface through the Viva connections. So that's again another app which is available in Teams. OneDrive for Business interface is available as an app as well. Yammer is now available as a communities app within Teams. And also, of course, the Teams channels and chats are already part of the Teams client interface. So actually, if we take out the Outlook an email component, which is still standalone on its own, primarily accessed through Outlook desktop, web, or mobile application, we are starting to see that some of the underlying infrastructure, OneDrive for Business, SharePoint, Yammer Communities, Stream, and a few others are actually now starting to become more, and also your planners and tasks are starting to become apps within Microsoft Teams. So overall, the shift is happening from still using the underlying technology, as you see on the right-hand side with SharePoint, Yammer, Outlook, and Stream, and making Teams as the primary interface to effectively communicate. And I've got one example here where we did this as a case study for one of the customer, where the communication team leveraged various channels to share their message. So key messages delivered through SharePoint intranet portal. Yammer posts as part of the engagements were published into the all company group, and also emails were sent out to as part of the all staff communications, and videos uploaded into Microsoft Stream. But Teams was sort of the majority of the people was the front end to receive all those notifications into one single place, into their activity center or the notification center, and be able to access Yammer post, SharePoint intranet articles, and the videos and the channel posts all through a Teams interface. So that's kind of has been quite an interesting study to kind of look at. We still see Outlook as a separate thing, perhaps something that worth raising in the cab with Microsoft on how maybe that transition will happen, and we're doing some work on that as well. But overall, Microsoft Teams is another way of kind of looking at and positioning as not just for chats and video calls, but also as a way for communicating your messages and channeling the communication through that single interface to people.
Wow, thank you so much, Vivek. Another good, thought-provoking value proposition from you with this one. It's something that we could all think about when we develop. I mean, our audience probably are the ones who are developing the roadmap for their own organizations or visualizing it for their organization. So thank you so much, Vivek. And if you have any questions for Vivek, again, please use the questions tab and the chat. So you know, Vivek would answer you very, very quickly for that.
Thank you. And sorry, I had to rush through 5 minutes.
No worries,
okay.
Vivek. Not a problem. Thank you so much. And we'll have Infotection back in June at one of our other events. So now we move quickly on to one of our very own, Rob. Let me just...
Well, am I up next, am I?
You are up next. I'm following...
Let me be as quick as I possibly can then. Let me just maximize my slides. Hopefully you can all see them.
Yeah.
Really want to buzz through this as fast as I can, but I just wanted to pick up on 3 key themes that I think came out for me from the last session we ran. So in the previous Maximising the Use of Microsoft Teams session a few weeks ago, there were 3 things that just jumped off the page chat was really talking about these. So I thought, let's pick up on them and see if we could answer some questions around those specifically. The first one, as you can probably see from the first slide, is meeting recordings. I think there's a lot of pain, shall we say, around how to manage meeting recordings and the different options that are available to you. The long and the short of it is, firstly, I don't think people really realize there are actually different types of meeting inside Microsoft Teams. There's 2 distinct types of meeting. There's a standard meeting, for want of a better word, which is almost going to be almost all of the meetings that you arrange. It's almost all of the routes for creating a meeting will result in a standard meeting. And what happens with a standard meeting is that the meeting recording will be saved in a folder inside the person's OneDrive who set up the meeting in the first place. But there's also a channel meeting, which invites all of the people inside the given channel into that meeting. And the meeting recording for that will be uploaded into the SharePoint side, as opposed to the OneDrive that's associated with the group that the channel happens to be in. So where you actually need to manage the meeting recording will vary depending upon the type of meeting that it is. But in either case, it's the retention, let's say, that you're applying to OneDrive or to SharePoint that's actually going to kick in and protect the meeting recording. Now, many organizations are choosing to also automatically delete meeting recordings after a certain duration, but it's up to you whether you want to, how you want to manage them, and you've got to apply that management within SharePoint or within OneDrive. Okay, moving on to the next topic, as I recognize we've got a very short amount of time here. So just wanted to take you through Teams provisioning, which was another topic that's jumped off the page to me last time we had this conversation. And I just wanted to give you an outline of a process that I think every organization should probably be running. Now, just for clarity, this sort of process of controlling the creation of Microsoft Teams is something that I would urge everyone to do, even if it doesn't matter if you've got 20,000 people or 2 people. I wouldn't just allow any members of staff to create their own Microsoft Teams. What I would do is have a process that controls their creation. Now, this could be an entirely manual process, just an email that gets sent to an IT admin or something who consistently creates the Microsoft Teams, or it could be fully automated at the other end of the scale. So there's a form that's filled in. Perhaps there's approval processes. Perhaps it just automatically allows the creation of the team. You can certainly, I've done this for clients in the past, automatically build Microsoft Teams, say, with the similar processes. Now, the important part here for me is the application of configuration, because it's at this stage that you can actually start getting really quite advanced. Once the team exists, once you've created that shell, you can start extending it with default metadata, setting retention labels, setting sensitivity, etc., and even building out a structure of channels, depending on the type of team that you're building. So building some form of process like this that's suitable for your organization, I think, is absolutely key to getting this right. Obviously, I could go into a lot more detail about that, but let's move on because I've only got probably about a minute left or very little time at all. So the last point that jumped out to me from the previous exchange was how on earth do we manage the great big volume of content that we've already accumulated over the last few years inside Microsoft 365? And the answer is it's tough. Retrospectively applying governance and retention, especially to your existing content, is not the easiest process. Now, while there are automated tools, as you've probably seen from sensitive information types, etc., and trainable classifiers that can help start to extend retention and DLP, etc., across some of your existing content, by far, what I would suggest you first focus on is not the great big mountain of content that you've got to start wading through. I would start turning off that dripping tap. Focus your attention on the provisioning process, control the creation of new teams and new SharePoint sites, sort out that first. And then, when you finish painting the 4th bridge, at least you don't have to start again from the other side of the Firth, if you see with a bad analogy. Anyway, that's enough from me. I'll let someone else take the stage, but hopefully that's been useful.
Thank you so much, Rob. Brilliant as ever. Thanks, Rob. And moving on along quickly, we have, last but definitely not the least, we've got Stuart Mayers from Objective joining us from Australia. I'm handing over to you, Stuart.
Okay, thank you, Maria. Is my screen and voice all coming through clear?
Yes.
Excellent.
Yes to both.
And thanks, Rob. That was a great update. I really enjoyed the session last time. It's worthwhile if you weren't sitting on it just to have a look. There was lots of conversations in the chat, and lots of sort of good points. And obviously, it's been such a hot topic. We've sort of come back today for sort of a part 2. So what I just wanted to do was just recap some of the highlights that I saw and just introduce some of the best practice points that I'm just hearing feedback from our customers about how they're progressing with teams, especially in a regulated environment. If you're not familiar with Objective, that's what we focus on. We've got customers worldwide. Some of the biggest ones in the UK, obviously, are Scottish Government and Welsh Government and Australian Defence here in Australia. But we focus on that regulated industry and government. So anybody who's really sort of got the spotlight on them, and either from a legal or regulatory point of view. We have the partnership with Microsoft, and I've had the pleasure of presenting with them a number of times. We've also got integration with Microsoft, with Micro Focus Content Manager, and happy to be an IRMS partner hence we're here today. So thank you for having me back again. So for us, we saw the growth in Teams in 2019, and then 20 when it grew exponentially. Obviously, IT had to roll it out from a communications point of view for many organisations. And at the end of last year, we started to see the trend where IM and IT were starting to get a grasp of where we want to go, what's sort of, where do we want to go forward, what's important for us. And as Maria showed in the surveys, we asked a couple of poll questions last time, and it said, where are you at now? Which is, many were using just Teams and channels for chat. But the opportunity was really, how do we govern the content in Teams? We saw 42% of the participants are interested in that. And then the interesting part for me was actually 45% were focused on on the maximising use of teams. So not just tick box governance, it's actually, well, how do we actually make the organisation operate better? I think that's one of the sort of key learnings, is it is that balance between, providing what's good for the users. The users want quick, easy, great technology and low overhead, whereas the organisation obviously has the governance like privacy and freedom of information legislations or legal subpoenas or whatever it might be, protecting your intellectual property. So the first step is, finding that balance on which one is right for your organisation. I know some customers just go in, it's just governance only, we just got to tick that box, and other ones are saying, no, how can we actually improve the business and leverage all the capabilities that is in Teams and keeps coming out in Teams. The second tip is the balance between IT and information managers and records managers. Yeah, the best customer interactions we've had is where they're both working together. IT own the platform and IM actually own the content. And when they're presenting a joint strategy to the business units, to see a lot more traction, a lot more effective results and a lot more engagement. So if you're not doing it, reach out to the other side of your organisation and engage and sort of get on the same page so you can go forward. I highly recommend that. It just works really well. Third sort of point is just understanding what sort of teams are out there. Organisational teams, there's been some transition from the intranet, from SharePoint to Teams, so dissemination of information will go through Teams. Teams can be often set up for project-based, meaning you spin up a team, you do the project, and you shut it back down again. And therefore, the team actually has a life cycle where it has a start point and an end point. And the growing sort of team I see is what we call a departmental team, where maybe the finance department spins up a team, and what they're doing is start cycling through the channels. And so the channels are the things that have the life cycles as opposed to the whole team itself. And so there's no one size fits all. I mean, most organisations have option D, all of the above out there. But just sort of consider when you're talking to different users out there, they're going to have different needs. Some people are just going to be, I'm in my application, and other users like in Tauranga City Council, New Zealand, they have so many users that they start the day and end the day, and they do their work in Teams, and they sort of leverage Teams as their sort of platform for starting their interaction and their business. So understanding there's a lot of balance, and users really want to have guidance about which application is the right one to use for my corporate content. And that'll help you guide your policies and use cases, just getting a good understanding. As we saw in the polls, policies were very rare, and that seems to be a common thing. I have heard organisations, the policies are quite strong. We're not using Teams until it's governed. But yeah, I highly recommend engaging in the policies. And if you're implementing change and you're building the business case, find that balance between what's required from governance and how you can drive efficiency as well. Next point is just giving content context. So as a records managers, you'll know that aggregating your information is important. For one, providing that information to the user so they can reference it, but also for retention and disposal in the full life cycle. So doing that when Teams is creation. So what Rob was talking about, I totally support that. You've got to sort of govern the life cycle of the team and help sort of from the very inception. And governance in place at the very beginning is key. So you're not sitting here in a few years' time going, what are these teams? Where does it belong? What's the content? The people have moved on and the team's been sort of shut down. So giving that context early is really key, so you can aggregate that with other related information. And the other sort of point is this is a list that's forever growing. It's sort of the top concerns, and we've been able to address these and sort of focus on these. The left is about the list of all the challenges. We've had a few of these talk today about retention disposal schedules, triggering a disposal from when the team is closed, etc. Or you talked about capturing conversations as well. City of Gold Coast, they implemented, because they're just worrying about losing content, that if the organisation, if outside the organisation they've got content that was shared by teams, but that's not inside the organisation, that can put you in a fairly risky and weak position. Teams lifecycle is sort of mentioned. And then on the right-hand side, there's a number of proactive things about how you make that user experience easier, how you drive adoption, remote access, mobile access. And then there are things, even we've talked today about recording of meetings is something that I think is a desire for many organisations, although I've had a few who say, nope, we're not allowing it. So, to maximise the use of Teams, I think there are a number of things to consider if you're looking how to proactively leverage Team. Cross-business unit collaboration or cross-agency or cross-department or external collaboration is probably the main point. Obviously, you need to consider the security aspects of that, especially when you're going outside the organisation. There's things for the user to do, hold the meetings inside the team and invite the team's channel to the meeting so they actually get that context, the chat, and people who may not be in the meeting can see the chat and the files, etc. You know, leverage the private channels and access to other applications. And the interesting one here is openness, which came out of NatureScot in Scotland. They had sort of transitioned, their researchers were using email before, which was quite private, but once they started using Teams and were having conversations in a team, other users were able to see those conversations and participate. They just found that researchers were able to collaborate a lot better. And so whereas email was a bit more restrictive and a bit more private. A new thing that's just popped up is the bloating of channels. Governance around Teams is one thing, but also I've heard of customers have told us that people keep on adding channels, and that's the way, you know, they've sort of got to put a bit of governance and control around that and support that. And I've already mentioned aggregations, you know, bringing all that information together into one place, your audit, your private channels, you know, your files and your posts is really key, from, you know, using it for your intellectual property and managing it through its full life cycle. And all the things we've talked about is what we sort of work with Gov365, which is the product. It basically manages in place Teams and SharePoint content. We capture the files and the conversations. So what we do with the conversations, which came up earlier, is we render the conversations as a PDF and so capture them so they can be indexed and searched and discovered. And that's quite a valuable requirement. You know, we support the governance of the lifecycle of the teams. And as well, we've got options to integrate with Objective ECM and also Micro Focus Content Manager. So that was a bit of a brief update. There is a Better Together white paper out if you're interested to see what we do and how we sort of collaborate extensively with Microsoft. So this was authored with Microsoft themselves. But if you'd like to find out more, I'm happy to have a complimentary value session. It's just sitting down and just going through all those points, understanding where you're at, sharing a lot of customer experiences that we've brought to the table. And there's so many more. I've only told you 3 or 4 here today, but there's so many more insights. So just to understand how you can plan what your next steps are and really use Teams to maximize the use of Teams, but also make sure you're doing that in a regulated environment and governing it appropriately. So thank you, Maria, and any questions, happy to answer, and I'll hang around for the chat, and feel free to reach out at any time.
Yes, thank you so much, Stuart, as always, from Objective. Now, as I ask everybody to turn on their cameras and we get into these discussions, you know, very, very key points that I'd like to point out for our discussions and with Teams implementation. If you have a chance to be able to think through governance before you implement Teams, take that chance. Because it would save you a lot of heartache, a lot of headache, if you like, and a lot of guesswork when you do that. Now, a lot of us are in a situation where, well, but COVID happened, we didn't have a choice. And the thing that you need to think through is you don't need to do a rapid governance implementation. You have to think through what happened when it was implemented, because you need to balance it out. There might be bad things that you need to quickly govern, but there are good things that might have come out of it as well. So those are the things that you have to think through. And the last one, of course, is what this roundtable should have given you is, I have seen a lot of organizations. I've been in consultancy for a while, and we have had these discussions over and over again. And a lot of people always tell me, oh, we do not have that budget to get the consultants in or partner with an organization. But what I have found over the years is that it was actually more expensive because it took years and it took more people to implement something, rather than if they've gotten somebody for a portion of that implementation, which could have been done really quickly. So sometimes you need to get that balance organized. And with that, let me open the question and answers we have. And thank you, Angie, for joining us. Do you have some burning questions for us? And everybody on the chat as well.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, Angie, we can hear you.
Yes.
Thank you for joining us.
No, I don't have any burning questions. We're in the very early and very slow stages of doing our migration from our network drives to SharePoint. And again, it was at the start of COVID that we started to look at this, and not a lot's happened over the 2 years for lots of COVID reasons. And just as you were saying on the end there, that we've got a consultant working with us to help us do information governance and migration to SharePoint and all that stuff, and it just seems to be taking forever because the organisation always has other priorities. I'm not an IT person, I'm not an information governance person, but I've been given that role as a project, and finding it difficult. So it's good to come on these webinars and find out so many different things, not only from the speakers, but from what people are saying in the chat and the questions as well. So it's really helpful.
Thank you so much, Angie. Okay. Do we have some questions? We've got 6 burning questions there. Have we got some unanswered ones?
Maria, it's not so much a question, but it was a question that was posed to me around user adaptation, I suppose, and how I'd find that. So I did answer the question, but we're very much at the start of rolling this out.
That's right.
And I do think that and I've put it in the chat as well, that this is a bit of a big culture change for us. We've been so used to using email and EDRM for 10 to 15 years that it's really difficult for me to even get the other information managers to even use Teams. I'm creating a document, creating a team site, uploading it into files, messaging them all to say, I've uploaded this, please have a look at it and review it. And very few people are actually looking at it. You almost feel like you have to email them to tell them, go and look in Teams, there's a document, and which defeats the whole point of it. And I do think there is a wariness of it because it's quite new, and they're a little bit afraid of because it's different. There's an uncertainty, and if you're uncertain, you're not keen to use it. But if they don't use it, they don't understand the benefits and they don't understand the weaknesses. If you don't understand the weaknesses, then how can you guess, or how can you predict what your users are going to come to you and complain about? So I think that, to me, that is a big part. And I think over the next, 12, 18 months, I suppose, as we roll this out more and more in the NICS, we will start seeing it. Yes. For me, sometimes it is really difficult to see how a lot of people will use Teams on a regular basis in the Northern Ireland Civil Service, But it will be interesting to see how that pans out. I don't know what anyone else thinks.
Why don't we ask our guys here? So Stuart, you were saying.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think that I've picked up on that culture point. It is really key. I've seen, because we deal extensively with governance, and I've had some organisations, they've gone out and rolled out Teams, and they go, oh, I want to go back. I feel comfortable in my application and feel with email. But other ones who've just totally adopted it's gone wild, and they're just sort of put the reins on it, just sort of give it a bit of guidance and nudge it in the right direction. I think that's key. And then other ones are sort of in between, where they've had groups and departments who are doing Teams and others haven't. So I think sort of finding that balance, it's not a one size fits all. That is really obvious to me, is that it's just not you can't just say this is going to work for everybody. But finding that balance and just talk to the different users and find the ones that actually help them operate better, and they're the ones where you'd start with, and just sort of build your policies and guidance around that, where I'd suggest.
Yeah, so that's where we've been working with, the slide that I showed on a global banking client, which was all about building that cultural change. So explaining to them, like Stuart said, building the champion network. What are the user experience, guidelines that we are going to need to do? How do we get that across? How do we explain to, a large 200,000+ people that this is a good thing? It's not something that it's a scary change. It's something that you can dip in, dip out. But then you're looking at then trying to explain to legal teams that chat's important to capture. That's the the nuances from all sides of the things, because from especially from how we approach it, it's very user-centric rollout, because otherwise it's just a license. You just give someone a license and Teams will magically appear on their web client, right? If you don't do the cultural thing, i.e. how are you going to use it? What is the channels for? How do you do the co-authoring? How's that work? How, why is everyone now replying to everything in picture format? Is that allowed? All of this is just a change aspect that people will either accept or not.
Maria, as a related question, there's one of the questions in the question from Helen, which is about, we have heavy use of private chat, but lower use of channels and channel meetings. Any tips on promoting channel usage over private chat?
Well, guys, respond first. I mean, you're my priority. I would have something, but please, I'm opening the floor.
I'm not really sure about, to be perfectly honest, but to quickly go back to the last point as well. Sorry, and I'm sure a lot of people who are on listening to this call will know that it tends to be the more senior people in the organization that love the new shiny toys, and to me it's really important for us in the NICS that we develop our policies and our standards around the 95% of people in the organization, not the 5% of the organization who genuinely think they're above any of the rules that they sign up to as well. Not sure if there's a parallel there with anything without getting too political, but yeah. So, but in terms of moving people away from private chat to a channel chat, I'm not really sure, to be
just like
honest.
email, isn't it? Isn't it coming back to that openness? Is that it's an education on the benefits of openness, and that's if you're doing private chat, it means they're scared that it's just like email. I'm just going to only copy these certain people in, and so it's looking for the benefits and how it can assist other people by participating in the conversation.
Rob?
About the context as well. So, if you've got a project, it's much easier for people on a project to start naturally using the channel messages over and above personal chat. But, they're still going to use personal chat for other things that are outside of projects if it's departmental very often. I think very often it's a sort of natural evolution process where the more familiar you become with the technology, the more you're going to start using it. There's a couple of other things, I think, more general points on comms that I'd like to raise. Firstly, for any of you familiar with ProSci, the ProSci methodology is a really good way of, getting a proper plan around your comms. I'd strongly recommend anyone who's not familiar with it to go and look it up. It gives you the ability to sort of prepare for the change and then execute the change and then evaluate how you did with your comms strategy. The second thing I'd like to raise is it's sort of around comms, but the transition to Microsoft 365 isn't just about telling people, what to do and when it's happening, etc. It's all around improving understanding of the workloads that are available in Microsoft 365 and how you as an organization want people to make use of them. So I guess ongoing training and education pieces, I think, is pretty important. And for anyone who's not, I'm just pasting it to chat now, but for anyone who's not come across it, I would strongly recommend taking a look at Microsoft's Learning Pathways tool, which is something that's freely available from Microsoft and can be installed into your tenant. And it effectively provides you with an up-to-date Microsoft, keep it up to date for you, guidance into how the workloads work. So you can almost use it as the hub of your sort of internal, I guess, training experience.
Vivek?
I fully agree with what Rob and others have said. I think it's also worth understanding why. Why do you want people to move away from chats? Why, I often see that people just think that having chats is a bad thing. It's not a bad thing. It has its own place. It has its own purpose. And when it is used in the context of that purpose, it's a great tool. But it isn't something which you would use for every single thing. The same thing with emails, the same thing with OneDrive for Business. And so, one of the slides that I shared, I think it's good to kind of map out where do you want certain technologies to fit in within your organization and how do you want to communicate that to people. And also, I think some of the use cases where, yes, there is an education, that message needs to be very succinctly and very simply explained in not using too many words, where people can actually retain that information. because there is a lot to know. There's OneDrive for Business, there is Yammer, Teams, chats, emails. We can go on like that, and there's more tools coming from Microsoft. And so I think that painting that picture to people, which somebody can, in the old days would stick on, next to your laptop or your desktop, where you have that as a reference. We don't have those days anymore, but I think something like that. And I think one of the other things is we are in a governance forum. Organizations are using retention and some of those capabilities quite effectively to kind of nudge people slowly towards the certain behaviors they want people to actually adopt. For example, maybe an extreme scenario, but one of the customer who early pandemic moved from Skype to Teams, they basically went quite aggressive and said, we don't have any persistency with messages today with Skype. And so what we are offering people of a 30-day retention of chats is enough. And they implemented right then and there retention capability within the chats, which actually did quite well to just instill that behavior, because people knew that in channels, their information will be kept for a little more longer than the retention period. I'm not saying that should be the driver. The first driver needs to be explaining and painting that picture to people.
Thank you, Vivek. Any other guys before I say something very quickly? Okay, so the first one is user adoption. In terms of user adoption, it's very important to explain. Remember, all our users, and I think I speak with all the organizations that we have, they have a really bad experience with technology being shoved at them for so long without an explanation. There's still a big reality with the Big Bang. There's still that reality for the users. And I see this in still a lot of organizations. There are exemplary ones, but I still see it in a lot of organizations. That has to stop already, because now you've got users who are so scared that this is another one of those things. So when you're implementing this, you have to look at it not from a technical perspective, but from the perspective of, as a user, how is it going to improve their life? How will they leave early because they've finished all their work, and because this is a more efficient way of finishing their work? And one of the other things is, how will it affect their daily log on, their users? You have to look at all of that aspects, because I have had horror stories of, a client going to us, we don't understand why Teams is not being adopted. We looked at the path of the user from logging on to getting into Teams. One government agency, the user had to log in 10 times. There's 10 different log-on screens that the users had to go through before going into Teams. And you have to say, well, there you go. If you were asked to log in 10 times before you actually get into Teams, will you use it? So those are all the practicalities. And one of the things we normally push all of these new technologies globally. One of the things within the Western world is, what is the benefit for the person? Make sure that you get that, because then you get the core user adoption. Of course, you will get the circle of the organization, the team, and all of that stuff later on. But focus on that. Now, in terms of private channels, this is one of the things where you really need to think through before you implement. Stephen mentioned before proof of concept was ever done with NICS, there was a big workshop with both IT and information management group, because those two really need to work together. It needs to be technically enabled, but it needs to have that IM outlook as well. And with that going through, they went through all of that, and private channels is something that always comes up. It shouldn't be something that hits you like, oh, we didn't know it was there. It is something that needs to be considered because of what it becomes when it is enabled. It becomes another SharePoint site that is unrelated to the existing teams. And the very reason why it was there was because that's the only way Microsoft could deliver their promise for a secured private channel. So, but it is not a mandatory thing. I think somebody asked me that it's not mandatory. It is just something that you need to consider. Why? Why do you need that? Because you don't need to enable that when you do proof of concept or for your initial ones. You only put it under exception. And then you think through how you would be able to control that area of it. And with that, very quickly, we have 4 minutes. Do we have any other questions? Any more burning questions? What I'd like to encourage everybody is please reach out to IRMS. Of course, please reach out individually to our roundtable. So we have Stuart from Objective. We've got Dave Kerrigan and Nathan Hambridge from Capgemini. We've got Vivek Bhatt from Infotection. We've got Rob Bath from Intelligy. And I'm sure Stephen would be very happy to answer your questions as well on the NICS specific implementation.
We do have a question on siloing that's come up in the questions.
Yes.
Around the SharePoint document storage side of the team being a silo. And I just thought I'd say, well, yeah, effectively, it's only visible to the members of that given group.
Yep.
I wouldn't suggest it's best practice, but certainly something I have considered and recommended people use in the past, perhaps, is to consider on the SharePoint side injecting into the visitors group at the point of creation, so that a wider group of people can have read-only access to the SharePoint side, but not to the rest of the group, if that makes sense. So it helps to break down the silo because, of course, you can search for content that you've got read-only access to if it's stored in the SharePoint site associated with the team. I'm not sure if Microsoft would ever agree with that. I don't know if they're still on the call, you know, as being an advised approach, but it's something that I would suggest you might want to look at.
Is Kyra still with us? Kyra from Microsoft? Oh, is she in the audience? Would you like to say something? Or we'll take that as a video, and then yeah.
So just to add, so the idea is it's a team, right? So the bit that I never quite understood about private channels and everything that we're talking about here is the fact that you're invited into a team because you need to view and see everything in that team and what they're doing. If you are not in that team, do you need to see it? And once again, it comes down to the culture of work and how you think people are hiding things or anything else like that. And also then giving someone external to the team access to something, which is where the tiered structure that we're doing between a team site versus a SharePoint site versus a organization only or view only and everything else. And then you get what is the private channel, which is you have a team. But you want to only limit this or these three, people within the team. It sort of breaks the ethos, right? The whole idea is it's a collaboration platform. The collaboration platform that everyone works openly together and everything. So yes, there is a SharePoint backend, and I had actually thought about using the the organizational wide guest access for viewing, but from how I see it is you're invited into the team as a sort of, security boundary, and anything that we do in here is, between us, sort of thing.
We had customers who wouldn't roll out private channels until we deployed the feature to be able to govern the private channels. But the thing is, if you are governing it, you've therefore got to respect the privacy and who can access that. But there's obviously, for information records managers, there's still a piece of business that they wanted to govern, and so they said no private channels, and then once we were able to govern it, they went, let them go.
And whilst earlier we were talking about migrating private channels within teams, yes, nightmare. So
definitely, that's why it really has to be thought through, and really sometimes I get frustrated that most organizations have not been told this before it was started. It was just left alone like that. So those of you who are on this call, hopefully now you have one of the lessons learned is private channels. Think through it. Think through it, definitely. So thank you so much. Now, as we have to close, we love to stay for longer, but I think we have to close at some point. But we will continue. We will be back after the conference. And Ren, I think we need to close.
Yes, first of all, huge thank you to all our speakers.
Thank you.
Thank you to all our attendees. Thanks for making it such a vibrant and informative session with your comments, chat between each other, the questions, the answers. So absolutely brilliant. And I think there's one last slide we just want to flag up, which is I hope to see a lot of you at conference in May. And those who aren't members, please do consider joining the IRMS to join in and help support all the wonderful work that's done. So
yes.
Have a great evening, day, night, wherever you are.
You have a great evening, day, night. As I said, reach out to everybody, to our speakers here. Reach out to IRMS. We're here to help. We're a community, and we will continue the conversations, not just with teams, but with everything that we deal with as information managers. Thank you, guys, and have a lovely day, evening,
Thanks,
morning. Everyone. Thank you. The recording will be available. What happens is after I end the event, an automated email will be sent to you with a link to the recording. But beyond that, we will be uploading this to the IRMS YouTube site where you could also watch our other events from IRMS. Thank you, guys.
Take care, everyone.
Take care.
Bye.